So next I want to talk about a little bit about moral judgment, how it develops and matures over time, because no one's born knowing how to make a moral judgment. In fact, it starts with this genetic potential. Parents nurture it throughout childhood, and biology plays a role here. But then the other thing that happens is kids actually have to practice making decisions and making moral judgments.
It's a thought process, and when you were talking about earlier on with the genetics and the potential, what we're talking about is the potential for reasoning abilities and judgment issues, empathy, those types of things. I mean, certainly you could be genetically predisposed to not be particularly empathic or caring.
Right.
Those are the factors that lead. Nobody's implying that there's some genetic code for right and wrong. These are the things that allow us to build up the moral systems.
Right. Yeah. You don't have a genetic set of rules that come down, through your DNA.
Right.
And in fact, morality is culturally determined. That's one thing that I think some of the theists don't seem to get. It is culturally determined.
And it changes.
Yes, it does. And that's okay. But there are a couple of child psychologists I wanted to bring up here that studied moral development that I think made a fairly significant contribution to our understanding of it. And this is by no means the final word, so if anybody out there is a psychologist and they want to critique me on this, I will accept constructive criticism, but I am not claiming that either of these are the final word. The first of these is Jean Piaget, who's a Swiss psychologist who did a lot of work with child development.
See, he's got a foreign name, so he must be an authority.
Yeah, there you go. But anyway, Piaget developed a two-stage model of moral development because he noticed that young children make moral decisions in a certain way, and then older children consider them in a different way. And essentially, the younger children believe that rules exist as fixed entities. They're handed down by some authority, and you can't change them. Okay? Whereas older children understand that rules are not absolute, and that we can change them if everyone agrees. So his dividing line between, when a child's moral sense changes was around 10 or 11. And the interesting thing that's happening in your brain, starting from when you're about 8 years old and continuing well into your teen years, is that the brain of a small child has a lot of neurons. And starting at about 8 years old, you begin a process of pruning the synapses. And so you're pruning basically things you're not using. So your brain becomes much more efficient. And as a consequence of this, you also develop higher reasoning capabilities. And it actually, this sort of brain development doesn't end at 10 or 11 or whatever. Like I said, it continues well into adolescence with the pruning. But development of the ability to make moral judgments continues pretty much for your whole life as you gain.
And that's a good thing.
Yes, it is.
Because, and not to derail the conversation, at some point, after 25 plus years of being a Christian and accepting those moral precepts, my world changed. Mm-hmm. I stopped believing in the Christian God and then eventually in any concept of God. And one of the first things that I had to do was consider this moral question, reevaluate what my positions were on nearly everything. Granted, once you make a decision about one thing, some others naturally follow. But I had to reevaluate it and say, okay, if my previous position was murder is wrong because God said it's wrong, then I need to figure out, is murder actually wrong and why? And basically, I had to follow that path down. So it's good, critical, I'd say, that we're able to actually reconsider those moral questions even as we get older. Otherwise, I'd still be going to church.
Yeah.
I would have had to get up much earlier today.
Yeah, because you'd probably been the minister, so you'd have been up preparing your sermon.
I'd been out drinking and partying. See if I'm sorry. I'm sorry to you ministers who don't drink and party. But anyway, go ahead.
So this, Piaget did his work in the 1930s. Later on, there was a guy named Lawrence Kohlberg who looked at Piaget's work and he said, yeah, you know, I basically agree with this, but I think it's a little more complicated than that. So Kohlberg developed this theory of moral development that included 6 stages. And so he divided these 6 stages into 3 levels. So we have level 1, which is pre-conventional morality. And in this stage, children don't even see themselves as members of society. They think in terms of a very individual perspective. Level 2 is conventional morality. That's where children first begin to see themselves as members of society. And then there's post-conventional morality, where we get into not only what's good for most people, but underlying principles that we use to define how we arrive at a just solution. So starting with level 1, we have stage 1, which is what we call the obedience and punishment phase. And it's very interesting because I have a 3-year-old son, and if you ask him why something's wrong, he'll probably tell you because you get in trouble if you do it. So children at this stage see things as it's wrong if you get punished, and if you don't get punished, it's not wrong. So it's a very simple way of looking at things. Later, they move on to stage 2, which is individualism and exchange. So they understand that the rules aren't fixed anymore. There's still an emphasis on punishment, but that's an understanding that you need to avoid that. But they focus on whether something's fair or unfair. So if something's unfair, then it must be wrong. And so you're allowed to break a rule if you perceive it as unfair. And I guess I should point out that one of the things that Kohlberg used as one of his moral dilemmas, he would tell people the story of a guy named Heinz, whose wife had some kind of cancer and needed a special drug. And there was a pharmacist who had developed the very treatment that she needed. So in order to obtain that drug, Heinz had to purchase it from this specific pharmacist. Now this pharmacist, he was able to buy the materials to make the drug for only $200, but he charged $2,000 a dose for this drug. And so Heinz could only raise half the money, even though he tried borrowing from friends and everyone. And so he went to the drugstore and he offered the pharmacist the $1,000 that he had for the drug, and the pharmacist refused. And so later, Heinz broke into the pharmacy and stole the drug. So Kohlberg's question was Heinz right or wrong to steal the drug? Okay, so someone in stage 1, a kid would say, oh no, stealing's wrong, it's a rule, you can't do it. Stage 2, a child would probably say, well, the pharmacist was being unfair, so it was okay for Heinz to steal the drug. And so that's an illustration of how kids in level 1, pre-conventional morality, make decisions. In one case, very fixed and defined, it's a rule so you can't break it. The second thing is, if it's unfair, it's okay to break the rule.